Now we've got a word from our sponsor coming up. We've got Bitmovin. Igor, are you out there?
Yes, hi everyone.
Perfect. Go for it. Talk to us.
All right, awesome. So Bitmovin, if anyone hasn't heard about Bitmovin, we are shaping the future of video. Just a couple words, we're really a video tooling company for software developers. It's interesting, I was listening to the last discussion, super relevant stuff. Our focus really is three tools. We provide a player that can be integrated into various sets of devices and platforms. We provide an analytics product, which is pre-integrated with our player, but also is modular and will work with other players to measure client-side telemetry and give you really good insights about what's actually happening from the user's perspective or from many users' perspectives. And we also provide an encoder, cloud-based encoder, deployable in lots of different modes and models, both managed as well as running in what we call a Cloud Connect model, which is where you can run it in your own AWS, Azure, or GCP accounts. And so that's what Bitmovin does, really kind of basic and simple. We put all of our energy and focus on developing those three products. And those products are typically integrated by our customers into their end-to-end OTT video services. That's all.
I've got to turn the mute off. There we go. I did it again. Thank you, Tim. Tim, I'm going to hand the panel to you. This is our last panel session of the day, and then we'll be going into 3 future briefings. But Tim, take it away. Let's talk about QoS. Let's go into the nitty-gritty.
Sure. And as a matter of fact, Mark asked the question in the last panel, what do you do with QoS? That's one of the things we're going to talk about here. So we've got Xavier and Brenton with us today, as well as Igor from Bitmovin. Thank you, Igor, for doing the overview of Bitmovin. Let's talk real quick about, we did the session at the very beginning of the day where we talked about the fragmentation in the CDN marketplace. And as I mentioned, we allowed respondents to choose multiple CDNs rather than just saying, what's your primary CDN? What surprised me was that of all the respondents that we had, there was probably only about 20% that only were using a single CDN. I'm just going to throw this out to the panel. Does that surprise you? Does it not surprise you that we're living in a multi-CDN world for most of your customers?
Yeah, hi, yeah. No, not at all. We've been seeing this trend for at least 5 years now. Nearly, not everybody, but nearly everyone. And actually, that's a pretty good percentage. That would pretty much match what I see in the market. Is that less than 20%, I would say, a single CDN, but nearly everyone is multi-CDN. And it's interesting the different reasons why, but I think we'll get into that soon.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that. Xavier, what about you? Does it surprise you that we're getting to a point where almost everybody is choosing to use multiple CDNs?
Yeah, this has been an evolution over the years, right? If you ask me to guess, I would have said maybe a third, right? So it's actually moving faster than I would have thought. But yeah, I think it's been a few years now since we started talking about multi-CDN. And in a way, it's good to see that the industry is evolving towards multi-CDN, because that's how you get the best quality of experience at the end. So I think it's positive news.
Okay, got it. And Igor, I mean, you mentioned the fact that your systems can be deployed on multiple cloud solutions. Was that, do you have customers who wanted to deploy it across multiples, or do they typically just choose one of those, say AWS or Azure?
Yeah, the point I made about deploying our encoder on different cloud solutions is really focused on the server side generating the content. But on the distribution of content, like Brenton and Xavier, I see the same thing. Now I see it firsthand with our customers. We see traffic going over multiple CDNs when we look at analytics reports and we look at measurements of QoS. We see that happening over 3-4 CDNs. So I'm impressed actually that it's only 20% are using single CDN at this point. I think years ago, before I worked at Bitmovin, multi-CDN was really a big topic for me and top of mind. Brenton and I and others have talked a lot about it. Likewise, I'm pleasantly surprised that so many have taken advantage of multi-CDN over the years. I don't have any objective metrics, based on data we have, but I think 20% on single CDN is pretty good.
And what are some of the, metrics aside, what are some of the reasons, if you think from a publisher standpoint, that they go to using CDNs? And Igor, I'll let you start with that.
Yeah, when I used to talk to prospects and customers about multi-CDN years ago, I used to say every CDN has a bad day, and it's true, right? It's not a fault, of a CDN provider or any particular network. When a bad day happens, it just happens, right? The internet is a mesh of networks. Interconnects go down, switches catch fire. All kinds of stuff happens with infrastructure. And so, the number one reason, I think, is always resiliency. You want your service to be as resilient as possible to the conditions that you cannot control. So what can you do? You plan for it, and multi-CDN is one of those tactics.
Okay, and Xavier, besides resiliency, what are some of the other reasons that you all see that publishers would choose a multi-CDN approach?
Yeah, I think it's to do with fragmentation as well, right? The fact that the various networks, various parts of the world have more or less, good connectivity, right? So what we see, at Broadpeak is customers, for example, building caches inside some ISP networks, and then, relying on the global CDNs for a broader reach, right? So in some networks, I'm going to have my own caches. I know I can get a very good delivery there, but for the rest of the world, where I may not have the ability to deploy my own caches, I will rely on global CDN. So it's also sometimes linked to a fragmentation and the way networks work, basically.
Yeah, fair point. So Brenton, how do you sort of identify and mitigate those problems? We talk about CDNs having a bad day, but obviously when someone's living in a multi-CDN world, there's decisioning that goes on there that if they feel like something's falling below a particular SLA or KPI, they're going to need to move. So how do you sort of measure and mitigate?
Yeah, well, there's two key ways. There's the audience data itself, so you can actually draw a lot from the many audience measurement tools that exist out there, and use that as part of the decisioning. Or you can do proactive probing, such as we do, to actually, which is very good for particularly sporting events, when you can actually do that testing before people start watching. So there's and it's a combination of those two sets of data. They both have their pros and cons, but combined, they're very powerful to allow you to make those really good decisions on what is the most appropriate thing. I think there's also just one more thing that comes into why you would do this. When most of the time, multi-CDN CDNs have a bad day, but on the massive events, there's no single CD. Well, none of the CDNs actually have the amount of capacity available to do a whole, Super Bowl. So actually you have to spread it out over a couple of CDNs because you can't actually get all that capacity from one provider. So there's good reasons to do it for pure capacity reasons as well.
Well, and you mentioned live, Brenton. So Xavier, what are some of the sort of additional issues that come up when somebody's looking to do live across multi-CDN?
Yeah, I like live, right? Live is a harder problem to solve than on demand. VOD in a way is easy, right? We have a big buffer and we can be protected. With live, if you had buffer, you had latency, so that's not an option. So you need this reliable delivery. And when it comes to live, what we are starting to see is obviously large audiences that are moving away from broadcast into streaming. I think, we already mentioned, DAZN, for example, getting the football rights in Italy. So going forward, the football will be streamed in Italy and not delivered over the broadcast networks. So what it means is we basically see a lot more spikes, right? So very short spikes of traffic, right? They don't last for very long. It might only be a couple of hours, but they're very high at the same time. And dealing with those spikes becomes an interesting problem because, like you said, you can't really have a CDN capacity that is built entirely for those spikes, right? So this is when we get into some interesting conversation, being able to optimize with multicast, for example, or being able to optimize with edge CDN, right? This is some of the conversation we started having with customers, the ability to say, look, when I'm going to have a big spike of traffic, instead of offloading back to a global CDN, what I'm going to do is spin up capacity at the edge of the network and then being able to serve this content for a short amount of time, right? So live, I think, is a particularly good use case when it comes to handling some peaks at the edge of the network, basically.
Well, and I think that harks back to what Erin from Intel said earlier today, where she was talking about the fact that you've got these build outs of hardware to peak capacity, which is only growing. What do you do with it when you're at your average bandwidth? And edge compute obviously is one of those nice plays. Igor, do you have anything else to add to that in terms of sort of the live issue? And if not, I've got it on.
Yeah, just one thing I'd add that kind of popped to the top of my head on live, especially is, as concurrency builds, performance tends to degrade, whether or not you use multiple CDNs. And so I think, and this is again, topic that was covered a little bit in the last session too, measuring quality of experience or quality of service is really key, because if you can measure it in a granular enough way, you can identify problems quickly enough to do something about them, especially in the case of live. One recent live event that we supported for one of our customers, we had an instance where they were kind of getting above the 900,000 concurrent viewers mark, and we started seeing that the total startup time started to increase. Seconds, like first milliseconds, then seconds increase as it kept going higher. And what we quickly realized, they were using our analytics product, is that the thing that was contributing to total startup time was DRM load time. And so we quickly pinpointed the problem to effectively overload on the DRM license services that were supporting the event. And that was, we were able to remedy those, but getting that data quickly and being able to, distinguish between things like what is player startup time versus video startup time versus DRM startup time, really it's a huge and important use case, especially if you're talking about live events.
Well, and I remember a couple of years ago writing an article about a big pay-per-view fight where the authentication server got overloaded in the 90 seconds before the fight started, meaning they had to delay the fight by 15 minutes till they could get everybody in who had paid for the transactional live. There's a question from the audience, actually from Pankaj Chaudhary or PC from Hulu, and it's specifically for you, Igor. He said, how's multi-CDN impacted the data collection strategy that you have for visibility, metrics, computation, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think two impacts, one, which is kind of the simple one, which is you need to collect data about the source of the content, right? Which CDN are the segments being served from, the video, the audio, the manifest. And if you can collect that information, then you can make, again, kind of smart reporting decisions about it. So you can segment things like, for example, startup time, and say, okay, compare startup time for all these sessions across all of the CDNs. And it's a pretty easy one because from a client, it's pretty simple to determine what CDN is the client currently using and pump that data back to the analytics platform so that you can correlate it with all of the other metrics you have. So I think that's one aspect. The second aspect is the correlation of kind of the broad set of CDN logs with client-side logs. I think that's probably been a holy grail for many. I know there are products out there that do this, but I haven't seen anything in the market that really allows you to do intelligent correlation of both server-side and client-side metrics in a single, reliable, and real-time platform.
Interesting. Xavier, Brenton, do you have anything you want to add in terms of how the analytics side and data collection has changed in a multi-CDN world?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting, right? Because Igor was mentioning you don't necessarily see a lot of solutions that can basically give you server-side and client-side information. Some vendors do. I mean, at Broadpeak we do it, but it will be limited to our CDN and our little plugin that goes alongside the client. I think the problem is obviously bigger when it comes to multi-CDN, and within SVA there are actually groups that are looking at harmonizing what's happening across multiple CDNs. I'm thinking, what is it, the QoE, I think a work group in SVA that's very much looking at that, being able to trace across CDN. So I think this is going to help us, right? Over time we're going to be able to correlate what's happening across multiple CDN and the clients. And I think what was said, previously on the session, that the truth is what happens on the client, right? It's nice to have all your CDN logs, but you don't necessarily know what has been played, what was the latency, what was the real quality of experience until you have this input from the client, right? So for us, it's always important to try and simulate what the client are doing. We're actually building sometimes, test environments that are taking the client behavior into account. So that gives a lot of insights, right? Because clients, sometimes they tend to synchronize or do things that, can upset the system. And, you can't just rely on your, good, healthy logic of HTTP to know really how the system is going to behave. We've seen all sort of interesting behaviors over the years, like CDN that are oscillating over time. So you see the load, they're becoming more loaded, and then it decreases and then it comes back up. So it's the effect of APR, but across thousands of sessions, hitting the CDN at the same time. So those are interesting, phenomena, and to really understand it, you have to go back to the client.
Brenton, anything else to add on this particular topic?
Yeah, well, I want to go back to Igor's point, because I totally agree with Xavier, but it's good, all well and good to have the client side stuff, but if you don't have the CDN data as well, and you're not able to join it up, Igor's holy grail, then you don't know the cause and the effect. And you actually need to know that, because if you don't understand if it's partly to do with the CDN, or it's partly to do with the ASN or whatever, you need to know more information. And by joining that information together, that's where we do it. And I'm actually part of the QoE group at the SVA that we're working on pulling this out. And we're doing a lot of interesting work with it. We've got some good proof of concepts up and running, and it's going to be it is going to be amazing, but it's a fair way to go. We've got to get all the players to actually to create that data into the CDN logs. But once it's done, it's actually incredibly simple. So we are hopefully going to be able to promote this concept and get to that much more easily than you would imagine. It's actually remarkably simple once you've got all the data joined up, and it's not that hard to do.
So you mentioned the Super Bowl, Brenton, and I remember writing an article years ago called Super Bowl Streaming Fail, where and Paul Tweedy sort of alluded to this from the BBC earlier, where your neighbor hears the goal on TV 2 minutes before you get it here. And you mentioned, of course, with something like an event at that scale, it's hard to find a CDN who can deliver that globally, or it's impossible to find one who can deliver that globally. You need regional CDNs. What are some of the other considerations that are prepare, for sort of a large scale event like that? We've got the Olympics coming up, obviously you've got the World Cup every couple of years, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, for those super big events that we often get involved in, preparation is the key. Having everything totally redundant, that like all the way through the train. So yes, you got the CDN, and then you've got your audience. But if it's not coming from the source all the way through, and multiple encoders, cross connect, everything totally redundant and automatic failover, and additionally monitoring your redundancy, that it's not going to be successful. So all the major players that get involved in that do that now, and that's but they're great lessons, I think, for people that are doing the second tier events to start to understand that redundancy and preparation in terms of who is in charge, what happens when certain things happen, and rehearse it, and basically get everyone on the same page. That they're the important things to do. But these big events are hard work, and they're run. They're huge teams. I mean, a Super Bowl war room has got a lot of people in it, I can assure you.
Xavier, you said live is a good challenge to try to solve. What about these big live events? What are some of the sort of feedback you give to people in the industry who are looking to host something live like that?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is, I said it earlier, right? More live being, streamed now, more content being, delivered over HTTP. I think, like Brenton was saying, what's really important is to engineer the delivery, right? Know what should happen, what is the level that's going to be accepted, have failover, have backups, right? So we know this is important, and we usually go back to having the content being served as close as you can to the end user, right? This is not new. This is CDN. You want to deliver as close as you can to reduce your distance, to reduce the chances of buffering, of latency, of anything happening with the network. So for us, the idea of putting caches deep in a network, works well, when it comes to delivering live. And multicast, right? So we also have the technology to push multicast all the way into your home and then run a mini cache, basically, we call it a nano CDN, inside your home gateway or inside your set-top box that then serves your client in the home. So that's another way to basically reduce your unicast segment to your home network, and then you feed those caches using multicast. So this is working today, and where we see, an interesting evolution of the industry is doing, sort of hybrid with basically a lot of very small caches deployed at the edge of the network and being fed with multicast as well, right? So if you look at a country like the UK today, you probably have about, 20 POPs, 10, 20 POPs, for the major networks. So this is where you will find your CDN capacity. Tomorrow, what we're seeing is basically going, in the next level of magnitude, right? So going into 100, 200 POPs. And this is where pushing multicast, live multicast to those caches and then serving API on the back of that becomes, again, an interesting proposition.
And I know you and I have had a sort of side discussion around ATSC 3.0, and that, of course, is a really interesting play for multicast about big live.
Yeah. So when we talk about multicast, right, we're not talking about legacy TS, right? Over multicast, we're not talking IPTV from the year 2000, although, that was good technology at the time.
I'd love to talk about that. So.
We're talking about ABR, right? So basically, how do I transport ABR over multicast? And ATSC 3 is really good technology for that. There's the equivalent in DVB that is being standardized as we speak. So it's called native IP. That's going to come out, I think, towards the end of the year. And the idea is to reuse basically those broadcast networks that have fantastic capacity, so the satellite, the DTT networks, and deliver API over those networks. So then you can be streaming to any screen inside the home, but using those networks that have been designed for broadcast.
And it really fascinates me from a help me stream standpoint as well. Igor, so what lessons learned for live events should we pass on to the audience?
I think from my perspective, it would be measurement and real-time measurement, right? Specifically for live events. I mean, obviously measuring bot consumption over time, great. Sometimes it's time critical, but usually not. For live events, you really need to have data at your fingertips, and it needs to be granular. So as close to real time as possible, closer the better. We tend to, for the Bitmovin Analytics solution, we guarantee a 10-second SLA from event ingest to making that available in dashboards and APIs. And I would say the better, the faster, the better. For live events, you've got to be able to measure and have that data at your fingertips to make the right decisions about how to resolve issues, but also just how to identify them in the first place.
Do you find customers come along and want the player solution and say, well, I don't really need the analytics because I assume it's going to work okay, and then they come back at some point when they've had an issue and they're like, hey, what's the problem here?
Yeah, sometimes I think at this point, most of our customers recognize the value of analytics. What we run into a lot as well, I already have an analytics solution, or I have 5 analytics solutions. And I think that's been the biggest challenge for our customers as well. How do you sort of sift through all the data you have exposed through various tools and APIs, and actually make sense out of it in a way that's going to impact your business. But yeah, we've definitely had instances where, someone comes along and says, no, player, if we do everything right, it'll just work. And then they get customer complaints. And then the question is, well, why are we getting these complaints? And that's when kind of the digging investigation starts.
Got it. Xavier, from your standpoint, when customers, come and they're trying to understand the benefits of the analytics, what do you tell them? What are not horror stories, but what are the industry learnings, say?
Yeah. So I'm smiling here in the background, listening to Igor. Yeah, we have customers, come in and, want, for example, CDN selection, and CDN selection can be done server side. That's the standard, I would say, easy way of doing it. Doing it server side at the beginning of the session. I pick a CDN and I send you to this CDN for the duration of the session. And it can also be done client side. Client side requires a little bit more integration. We have a plugin that basically will connect to multiple CDNs, and then in real time find out what is the best CDN for your particular session, right? So it may be that you're connecting to a global CDN cache that's not working really well, and you'd be better off to another global CDN. And the interesting thing is usually, integrating onto the client is more difficult. So we get into those conversations that, I already have, client integration done with other vendors. I know it's difficult, so I'm only going to do the server side. But then when you do server side, you can't do in-stream switching, right? So it becomes a little bit more difficult. And typically customers come back after a while saying, how do I move someone that's connected to a global CDN onto a local cache if the session is already established? And this is where there's unfortunately a little bit more work required to do it client side and to do the in-stream switching.
And Brenton, anything to add to that?
No, I'm only just amused by what Xavier just said. I know too many people who thought they had CDN selection, and it was that session-based one where it's like, I'm sorry, your session started, you can't switch it now. And they go, what? Why is that happening? But we know it's bad, but you can't do anything. You took the simple approach. You've got to take the more advanced approach. So there is a lot of different ways. There's a few more ways coming online. It's getting better, but it's not. I don't think it's as advanced. It has been as advanced as most people think, or they have thought the simple solutions do everything, and it's just not true. You got to do it properly, and it's hard work. So go to the experts.
And I'm going to end with a question that I'll throw out to all three of you all, which is edge compute. We hear edge compute. We did the survey, of course, and we're seeing it's still early days for edge compute. Where do you see that playing in models around quality of service and models around, making decisions on CDN switching? You, Xavier, sort of alluded to the fact that if you could do it at the client side, then it allows for quite a bit of flexibility. But where does edge compute play into this?
Yeah, so when it comes to edge compute, one thing to bear in mind is this is going to be a more expensive setup than your traditional CDN, right? If you think about it from an operator standpoint, you have your current CDN in place, you may have a global CDN as a backup serving content from further away, and then very close to your end user, you have this compute platform that you will use, but only, I think, for the high audience, the high value event, and in my mind, probably premium sport, premium packages, right? This is where it makes sense. I think when you look at, where, edge compute is today, there is still a long road. We've done a lot of experiment with wavelength today. So AWS wavelength, that's basically doing edge compute inside today Verizon's network in the US. So it is great to play with the technology to see, that a cache will be very close, literally no latency, very little distance. So your quality of experience will improve, but you run into bigger problems, right? You run into, for example, the ability to locate a cache at the edge of a mobile network, right? You need to use make APIs that have just been standardized by HC and 3GPP, right? So, you may solve part of the equation when it comes to quality of experience, but from a technology standpoint, there are, other challenges to solve. So I think we still have, a few years ahead of us to really tame the beast, right, when it comes to edge compute, but it is going to be a really interesting conversation, right? I think at the end, we're going to get to setups where we're going to be able to move, for example, the caches depending on the session. So at the beginning of your session, you may start with, an edge node serving you the first 30 seconds of your video if you're doing VOD to fill your buffer, and then be hand off to, a global CDN serving you from much further away, knowing that you have, the cushion of your buffer in case anything happens. So we're going to get to those interesting models where, even within a session, you may use a little bit of edge compute and only use it when required. So it's going to be interesting, I think.
Well, and it's fascinating that you say that, because I think I alluded real early on in the day to the whole it's a download model where we used to put 30 seconds out there so that as you started to watch, then let the system know that it begin to download the files. Igor, Brenton, anything to add to that sort of where the edge compute space plays?
I love edge compute, but I haven't. People have talked. The only use case that sounded interesting to me was manifest manipulation. I think there's definitely opportunities there to do some cleverer things that could actually help QoS. And taking that a step further, potentially server-side ad insertion could be a really interesting edge opportunity for low latency streams, because doing it right back further could be a little bit could impact latency. But yeah, I think it's a great, interesting field, but it's very, very early days yet.
Got it.
Yeah, only thing I'd add is there is a case to make for measuring at the edge and comparing that to measurements at the client, right? So what is the delta between measuring at the edge, ideally on the same network as the client, and the client itself? I think that could give you insights into what's going on in a home network, what's going on in the neighborhood, right? What might be happening that is sort of outside of our view today that we don't know how to measure.
Which is interesting, because in the telecom days, and I came out of part of that, we could measure at the SLIC. So we knew, within a neighborhood or a couple neighborhoods where the potential problems are. And that's a very good point to do.
Same idea, yeah.
From there and at the actual client endpoint to see. All right, Dom, we actually talked about multicast. We got that in there somehow.
You did. I've had it so many times today. I'm grinning. Great.
Playing the flag here.
Awesome session. Thank you so much, everyone. That was a brilliant one. Xavier, Brenton, brilliant. Igor, thank you so much for taking part, and thank you for sponsoring today. And Tim, thank you for moderating.